Hi, everyone.
Good afternoon, Chris. Thank you for putting yourself available again for us. I think we're going to have a smaller audience today.
Mhm.
Again, we're recording this, then we're going to put it up there so that people can see it after. And got your email where you're talking part 4 is basically you're going to reserve that for your presentation at finance. We'll start the meeting by again acknowledging we're on Treaty 1 in Dakota Nation's territory and traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm going to turn my video and audio off. Colleagues that have joined this call, I hope you see my chat. Have your video off, mic off, and if you have questions, type them into the chat. Chris will do his best to answer them. Again, I assume it's like last time, Chris, where the questions they may have may get answered further. So over to you, kind sir.
Yeah, I'll just say, if you don't mind, I'd like to do a break in between the second and third so we can keep them as separate videos.
Okay.
So I'll tell you when we're done the second. So picking up, I'm just going to open my files here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Your screen is visible, but you don't have a presentation up.
Yeah, I will. Okay, I will start now. So basically, this document is the one from last time. We will pick up where we left off. So part 2 of this presentation is about vehicle displays. So most of this is going to be a PowerPoint presentation, but there's a few things we're going to start off with. So beginning is configuration in the engineering manual refers to where you place signal heads, number of signal heads. So for example, for different types of left turns, you might have one on the boulevard, one in the far left corner, one in the boulevard, one on the near side, things like that. All of that is configuration. So I'm going to start off by showing some of the changes here. So starting off with this intersection here, this is Jubilee Avenue in Coburn. You can see that the displays here is a lower right side display and an upper left side display. And then a few years later, they reversed it. So now the lower one became the upper and the upper one became the lower. So this is a pattern we see across the city where they really can't make up their minds which ones they want above the road and which ones they want beside the road. This was their preference for many years, to have the right one above the road and the left one on the side, but that is changing continuously. And you can see here on just in the opposing direction, this one has 2 above the road, and it should still be like that today, I believe. And yes, it is. So this is the example of the continuous back and forth we see. Now, some intersections actually will change multiple times. So this is the intersection of Barrie and I believe it's Sargent. This intersection was rebuilt in 2015 as part of a renewal. So you can see here it starts off with their normal right one above the road and left one on the side. Then after the 2015 work, the left one got put above the road. This is, again, from repeating from the last presentation, this is called a davit. So now we have 2 above the road, and then they went back and put the one on the left on this from above the road back to the side. So now it's back to how it was in 2014. So it stayed like that for a couple of years. Here it is still in 2019. So it was like that from about 2017, 18, 19. And here it is again. Here it is still today. And you can see on the other direction here, we have 2 above the road. Here we have 2 above the road and 1 to the side, and 2 above the road. So you can see that there's this constant changing of above the road to the side or back to above. And this one is the reverse of that. You can see this one again is above the road and then got moved to the side. And this one's above. So that's just a bit of an opening. Now, one project the city did is they changed signal heads. Starting in the early 2000s, the city decided that they didn't want to use 8-inch lenses anymore. Now, 8-inch lenses are still Canadian standard. If you read the National Engineering Manual, 8-inch lenses are still standard design. The two options are 8-inch or 12-inch, and many cities are still installing 8-inch brand new. Ottawa, Toronto, London are notable examples. So to go over a bit of the progression here, you can see this here is an 8-inch, 8-inch, 12-inch head. And these three here are all 8-inch without a backboard. So the all 8-inch are the oldest ones, and then there's the 8-8-12. Around 2012, they did a project of changing out all the 8-8-8s. So now you can see we have an 8-8-12 above the road and 12-12-12 on the side of the road. Now, in later years, they've come back and now repeated and taken out all of the 8-8-12s, including even newer ones. So these ones here in this particular intersection were pretty old, but I certainly don't think that these above the road ones were necessarily past their useful life. You can see it's actually on a newer silver davit, but they included changing heads at intersections that were actually relatively new. So here's the intersection of Hespeler and Beatrice. You can see these are all 8-8-12s. And the argument that I've made is that if 12-inch lenses are big enough for major roads, 80-kilometer-per-hour roads like Bishop Grandin or Kenaston, then it certainly would be overkill to be having to use that size on these little residential roads coming up here. So it really is a hierarchy of treatment, and the engineering manual simply states that you should be using 12-inch reds in 80-kilometer-per-hour zones, and after that, 8-inch or 12-inch are the options. So here we have a lower speed intersection. In the case of the cross street here, single lane, low volume road, using the Canadian standard 8-inch, 8-inch, 12-inch lenses. And these are all relatively new. You can see the whole intersection is done. They went in 2018 and did a mass change out intersection wide to 12-12-12. And so basically what's going on here is we're changing out heads that are not past their useful life and are still Canadian standard, including on these minor low volume intersections. And when you look at other cities, they're installing these heads brand new still on major roads. And in some cases, the heads and the lenses are quite new. You can see this checkered pattern here of this red, and I believe the other one was too. That proves that these lenses were already the LEDs. So conversion to LEDs is simply not a justification for having done this. Many of them already were LEDs. Now, even after changing all these heads to 12-12-12 from 8-8-12s, they've also got different generations of heads, and I've never yet seen a head go back up that was of an earlier generation. So using the same intersection here, I call these the bubble backs. These were the first generation 12-12-12 heads used from around, these ones were put up, I believe, around 2007. And you can see that these are aluminum frame and they're all 12-inch lenses. This is the same intersection. 2014 to 15, you can see that the backs are now this squared off pattern, and there's these gaps here between the lenses. Then in 2016, now you can see they've been changed again, and they're these solid back heads. And then in 2017, they've gone back to the square ones. And all around the city, you will see them continually changing the heads. Now, the only operation.
Can I ask a quick? Can I ask a quick question? I did ask it in the chat, but I'm using an old tablet and it's got an old version of Teams on it where I don't have the opportunity to raise my hand. But in terms of the heads that you're talking about and the guideline that you reference, is the guideline the Bible in terms of how these, from a standards perspective, how there's what's supposed to be used and where, or is it a guideline in the sense that if the city had a surplus of one style versus the other, or was out of stock on one, could they use one in place of another on an interim basis? Is that a justification?
Absolutely. And the variations I'm showing are largely differences between manufacturers. It's very minor variations. The point that I'm making is the wastefulness of changing between types of heads and not reusing them or putting them back up. And we see this continual changing between these varieties that it seems like every couple of years the city will go through a different type, will just change to a slightly different variation of head. And what I've never seen is slightly older ones going back up, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so that's my main point here, is that there really isn't an operational difference. What we're seeing, though, is just this continuous waste. And I'm using this intersection as a demonstration of the different generations of heads. So going back here, you can see this is the type that didn't have a reflective stripe. And now we're into a later generation, still doesn't have. Around the 2016 era is when they were using this fully reflective backboard. You can see here it's all reflective. Then in 2017 is when they changed back to now having a thin reflective stripe. So you saw the other one was a wide reflective stripe. Now this is the thin reflective stripe. The one they're using now appears to be a medium width reflective stripe. So it's very subtle differences. But the point that I'm making is that using these subtle differences from the different generations of heads as they change every couple of years, the fact that the slightly older generations are not going back up, it's showing the wastefulness of that these heads just seem to be scrapped at every opportunity, anything that's not the exact current one that they happen to be using. And this is on top of doing this citywide mass change out of the 8A12 heads. So to give an example, we can look at this intersection here, because the city was doing a lot of head changing in isolation relative to the pole changing. So using this intersection, Hartford and Main, you can see here going back, here's the older generation 8A12 heads. Now some of these are pretty old. This one's definitely faded, so I wouldn't see an issue with changing that one. But when this change out happened here, it was done in 2016. So you can see now that this head got, these heads, intersection wide got changed. And you can see here that this is now the variety that they were using in 2016 with the wide reflective stripe. So you can see that this head was brand new in 2016. Going back to 15, you can see it's the 8A12. In 16, it's now got the wide reflective striping. And then in 17, they changed the pole. This head's only a year old. Instead of moving the head over, they changed it to the type with the thin reflective stripe around the border. Instead of but this head, even though the pole was old and rusty, the head was only a year old. So they could have just moved the head over to the new pole, or they could have just left the 8A12 up for another year and done it with the pole in 2017. So the point is it's these wasteful practices we see of heads going in, coming out, changing the head, then changing the poles, and these earlier generation heads are never being reused. And going back to configuration, here's another example of this is called a protective permissive left turn. I'll be talking about this in a minute. And you can see we have 3 heads here, 2 above the road and 1 on the left side. And then around 2011-ish, they changed to take out the arrow on this head. They converted this one to a black head and took the side one out completely. Then they went back 8 years later and then put the side one back in, the one that they had in the exact position where they had taken it out from. So it's showing how the configuration really doesn't have a standard. And another example is, this is again the 2016 pole, head that has the wide reflective striping. This is Maryland and Portage. And then if you look at it now, it's the same pole there, but now it's the variety with the thin reflective striping. And on a citywide basis, whatever renewals are done, Salter McRae is a noble example from this summer, you see this constant just swapping out of heads to whatever their current flavor is of that 2 or 3 year period. Now, The latest thing the city has moved towards is side mount heads on the lower right side. I don't fully understand why, but here's an example. This intersection was rebuilt in 15. You can see there's no side mount head here. And we jump up to 2017. They took out the left turn arrow. You can see there's still no side mount head. As of 2018, it got added. There it is. Now, this was a thing that they started doing and seems to be about mid 2017, was adding these side mount heads. It was abandoned in 2018. So all through the mid 2018, 2019, and 2020, they weren't using the side mount heads. And now, as of early 2020, they have now gone back to doing it. So here's an intersection of Chief Peguis and Main. And if you go there today, there's a lower right side head here. And it'd be the same with the other side. And there it is, as of 2021. And there's no pattern for lane count. It seems like they want to use this lower right side head whenever there's more than one lane, but that doesn't make any sense, because if there's multiple lanes, then you would just have more overheads or more to the or left side head, things like that. But this right side head is typically there for people turning right, yet they're popping up at intersections that don't even allow right turns, or where there's lane drops, or there's right turn channels. And again, from the perspective of the driver turning right, it doesn't matter whether there's 1, 2, or 3 lanes to their left. That really doesn't matter. And this is an intersection that was rebuilt in 2020, and you can see there's the lower right side heads on the 2-lane side, but also on the single lane, they've added these lower right side heads. And this intersection was an anomaly. Now, this was done in 2020. If you go back to 2019, just the year before, this was all part of the same project. That was Corden and Wilton. We can now go to Corden and Harrow, an intersection that's pretty much identical in all ways. 2 lanes on Corden, 1 lane on Harrow, done just the year before. And you can see no side mount heads. So this again, and on the case of Harrow, this left side heads down on the side, but it isn't on this side, only on the one side. But yet it's the same road, whether you're going northbound or southbound, it's the same road approaching Corden. But yet this side, they decided to put it up above the road, and on this side they didn't. And it's random. And what we see in renewals a lot of times is heads that are above the road will be moved to the side, like we see Barrie and Ness, or heads that are on the side will then move up. It's this constant just back and forth that we're seeing. And when I've called this into question with the department, the answer I continuously get is they don't have a standard. They don't actually have any organization. It's done by the whim of whoever's in charge of a particular project. And that's just completely unacceptable. So that's my opening on vehicle displays. Now, the rest of this presentation is actually a PowerPoint. So I'm going to transition now over to doing this as a PowerPoint. So to show this pattern of heads going continually in and out and the inconsistency, I'm now going to first talk about T intersections as an example. The diagram that you see on the screen here is the case where you'll have an intersection where the stem of the T, the traffic approaching, must turn right. So it's a dual mandatory right turn. There is no possibility to go straight through because it's a T and you can't turn left. And there's a handful of these intersections around the city. University Crescent and Pembina, Jubilee and Pembina, Jubilee, part of Jubilee and Osborne. You can turn left, but from the perspective of the right turning traffic, that part of it's still the same, the dual right. So there's quite a few of these around. Now, Dunkirk and Fermor is another one. So the difference that I want to highlight, though, is this is the way that I argue the heads should be done. There should be a right flashing arrow telling traffic that they must turn right, and also that there isn't an adjacent crosswalk that they have to yield to. When there's an adjacent crosswalk, then you would use a solid green ball. So this is University Crescent and Pembina. So right flashing arrow, the way I'd argue it should be done. But here, the left one is Fermor and Dunkirk. The right one is Jubilee and Pembina. And these ones don't have right flashing arrows, even though both are the exact same situation. There is no pedestrians crossing the major road, and it's a mandatory 2 lanes must turn right. So whether we see, in this case, the flashing right arrow or the solid green ball is just completely random. This has been something I've been arguing about since 2007. And left turns were equally as inconsistent, although as of about 2016, most have now been corrected. So that's just an opening comparison showing continuous inconsistency. Now, going over to left turn displays, this is called a protective permissive left turn. There's 4 types of left turns. The first is a prohibitive, where you can't turn left either because it's restricted or it's a one-way street or a T intersection. It's not allowed. The second one is a permissive left turn. That's where you would have a normal red, yellow, green head and drivers turn left while yielding to an adjacent crosswalk or opposing traffic. The third type is protected only, and those are the type we predominantly see in higher speed roads like Bishop Grandin or when there's more than one turning lane. And those type will involve an arrow that comes on telling traffic to turn left, and then when the arrow expires, then there's a separate left turn display that actually goes red, and you cannot turn left other than only on the arrow. That's called protected only. And then the fourth type is a hybrid of permissive and protected only, and that's called a protective permissive. Protected permissive is, as in this case, is commonly seen with a 4-head display, and it'll be a red, yellow, green. And what we see with these ones is the green arrow will come on, giving the protective phase of the left turn, telling drivers they turn left and they don't have to yield to opposing traffic or pedestrians. But then when that arrow expires, the green light will still stay on, assuming as long as it's a leading as opposed to a lagging. And drivers are still allowed to turn what's called permissively, where they will then yield on the solid green. So what I want to show is the different examples of the configurations that we see over the years. And when you look around Winnipeg, a lot of this seems completely random, but it actually isn't when you start considering the years and the different eras that this work's done in. So starting off, this intersection is Stafford and Academy. This is the left turn to go on to Stafford off of Academy. And you can see here we have 2 left turn arrows. This is what's known as duplicity. And it's quite important to have duplicity because if a pole's down, which is especially common in Winnipeg because we use breakaway standards for safety, they're designed to break off when they're hit, so they're very commonly knocked down. When a standard's knocked down, the intersection can still operate with the other head, or if there's a burnout, it's just if the arrow burns out, the other one is still functional. So duplicity is very important in engineering. It provides a fail-safe, also sometimes known as redundancy, and even when there isn't a failure, it still makes the left turn arrow more visible. So this was the older way that Winnipeg did it, and this is also the provincial standard, and done on all provincial highways. You will see duplicity all across the province. But Winnipeg in the early 2000s decided not to use duplicity anymore and only wanted the left turn arrow on the farthest left display. So starting in the early 2000s, they started changing out citywide to this configuration where the arrow was taken out on the left side head and on the right side head, and the left side head was converted to a black head. So in this case, there's only one pole with a head that has the left turn arrow. So if there's any kind of bulb failure or anything here, that arrow is completely out of service. That was their standard from the probably very early 2000s up until about 2011. Then they started using what's called the auxiliary head, which is this near side head at the stop line. Now, this doesn't provide a substitute for duplicity because let's just pretend this light was red and the arrow's about to come on. You can see this black truck near the stop line position. Well, that driver has no way of seeing this head up above him. So you can't have satisfied the duplicity requirement by putting one on the near side. The engineering manual states that this is what's known as the auxiliary head, and it's used in cases where there's obstructed sight lines approaching the intersection or for very wide intersections. But Winnipeg in 2011 just started using it overall at all locations that they worked on. So this was done for 2011 to 2012. Then in mid-2012, it was abandoned again, and this is an intersection. This is Chief Peguis and Gateway Road. This intersection was built in 2011, so you can see the left turn arrows here on Chief Peguis have the auxiliary, but Gateway Road was not. It was built as a permissive left turn initially. The protective permissive was added later. And by the time the protective permissive was added, the city had by then abandoned using the near side heads. So you can see this one didn't get it. Then in 2015, they started using these double poles with the two left turn arrows over on the side like this. Now, at the time, I also argued against this configuration because having these two left turn arrows like this implies that there's two left turning lanes. This is how I'd argue it should be done when there's two turning lanes, but there shouldn't be a second arm like this with two arrows because drivers easily mistake this. And so through the summer of 2015, there was about 25 of these put in across the city on these double poles. This is a cantilever style, as you'll recall from the first presentation. I also call these T-poles. So by mid-2015, I guess the city came to the same conclusion I did right from the start, that this was a bad idea. So they spent 2016 going around the city and took them all out. So the 25 that were put in throughout this late 2014, early 2015, those double poles, all but one were removed. They were in the case of the cantilever, the arm extension was taken down, or in the case of the ones that had davits, the whole pole had to be changed. And they went back to the 2011 standard of having one on the far side, one on the near side. Again, the auxiliary head. So that began in mid-2015, early 2016. As of 2021, the city has now again abandoned the auxiliary heads. This is Bishop Grandin River Road. This is protective permissive, formerly permissive left turn. This arrow never used to be here. It was added. And by the time this one was added, just like Gateway and Chief Peguis, with the first time around, they had now abandoned the near side head. So this one didn't get the auxiliary. And that seems to be where they're at now is we're back to the early 2000 standard of only one turn arrow on the far left side or on the boulevard. This is the configuration that I would argue for. It's also the one in the engineering manual, and it's also the provincial standard. In the case of this one, you have your one head on the boulevard for one turn lane, and then you have one in the far left corner. Now, I argue that this head's very important, especially for protective permissives, because drivers, when they're turning left, have three things that they need to look out for. You have to watch for opposing traffic, and you have to watch the signal head, and you have to watch for pedestrians. By putting the signal head over to the right of the driver, so the driver's got to look for the signal head to the right, they've got to look in the middle for the opposing traffic, and then they got to look all the way to the left. And what happens is drivers will sometimes forget about the pedestrian. They'll see a break in traffic coming, they'll tunnel vision on that break while watching the signal head, and then when that break comes, they will hammer the gas trying to get through on that break in traffic and forget to watch for a pedestrian. If we had a supplemental head over here, it would be encouraging the driver to look over on this side of the intersection where the pedestrians actually are. So that would be a massive safety benefit. And that's why this is standard in British Columbia, provincial standard, and also the standard shown in the National Engineering Manual. This particular location was McPhillips and Logan. This head was put up in early 15. I think this was part of their bouncing around with those double poles. This head never actually saw service. It remained hooded throughout that summer, and then the whole thing got taken back down again. So as far as I can tell, it never actually saw active service. Here is one of only two locations in the city for protective permissive left turns that are done the way I'd argue they should be in the case of a divided road, boulevard, and far left corner. This one is Chalmers and Watt. The only other one in the city is Academy in Wellington. This is a really weird one that popped up for a little while. Again, this is McPhillips and Logan. This is now the westbound, though the other one was the southbound, where they had this far side head in the position where I'd argue that there should be a head, but with a left turn arrow, but only the middle one had the left turn arrow. So this one made absolutely no sense. It was up for a while, and then eventually this head just got taken back down. Now, this here shows the pattern of this continually changing configuration standards. This is Pandora westbound at Plessis, and you can see here on the top left, this is the city's original configuration of having 2 yellow heads and 2 left turn arrows satisfying duplicity. And then I think it was around 2014, they changed and took out the left turn arrow, so changed the whole head above the road and only put in the left turn arrow on the left side on a new black head. Then in 2015, they were going to these double heads, and you can see here they changed out this shaft pole to a davit and added a upper left side head. So now we had 2 left turn heads. And then in 2016, they went back again, took the davit back out, went back to the shaft pole like they had it in 14, but then added a near side auxiliary head. That was done in 16. And if that intersection were worked on today, this near side head likely wouldn't be there at all. And the only reason there's not more pictures here is that they often change over their preferences so fast that they never actually get the intersection up to standard, the whole city up to standard before they change again. So looking at this one, for example, this first configuration survived all through 2011 and 12. Had they gotten to changing it then, they would have put in the auxiliary head then, but they didn't. They didn't get to it till 14, and so by then they abandoned the auxiliary heads. So then it was round 2 that it eventually got it. And again, if it worked on today, it wouldn't get that. So now let's talk about protected only left turns. That was the third type that I categorized at the beginning of the presentation. Protected only left turns are, again, to refresh, the type where you can only turn left on the arrow. You have to wait for the arrow. And again, they're common in high-speed roads or if there's multiple lanes turning left. This is the intersection of Lagimodiere and Fermor. And you can see that originally this intersection only had 1 turn lane for all 4 approaches. The left picture is the northbound, and you can see there's only 1 head, 1 turning arrow for the northbound with 1 turn lane. But on the westbound, there is also 1 turning lane, but 2 heads. So this has been the tradition we've seen in Winnipeg right from the late 90s, early 2000s, it was just completely random whether there was 1 head or 2 heads. Now, originally the city suggested that, well, the 2 heads were used at locations where there was truck traffic. But Fermor and Lage are both major truck routes, so that just simply didn't hold up. And we often saw 2 left turn heads on roads that didn't have any truck traffic, turnings on the residential streets, while seeing like 1 turn head on roads that have major trucking routes, like St. Mary's Road in Bishop Grandin. The southbound has only 1 head. And again, just like protective permissive, the same pattern held. This is, again, Chief Peguis and Gateway, and it was built in 2011. And that's when they started using the auxiliary head, but they maintained their pattern of being completely random as to whether there was 1 or 2 far side heads, regardless of lane count. So in this case, this is Chief Peguis and Gateway, and you can see there's only 1 turn lane and 1 arrow on the far side and 1 on the near side. This here is Chief Peguis and Henderson southbound. This intersection is especially problematic. This intersection, 3 of the 4 approaches to this intersection have 2 left turn lanes, being eastbound, westbound, and northbound. Only the southbound approach to this intersection has 1 turn lane. Yet all 4 approaches have the 2 far side heads and the near side heads. This is in this particular picture, this is the southbound with only 1 turn lane. So again, looking at the configuration of the signals, there is no differentiation to tell which approaches to this intersection has 2 lanes or 1 lane. And that was in 2011. And then around 2012, they abandoned the near side heads, just like they did for protective permissive, but then seemed to start this pattern of finally using 1 head for 1 lane and 2 heads for 2 lanes. But this 1 head is problematic because, again, there's no duplicity. Now, the city argues that we need to have protected only left turns, which are much more restrictive than protective permissives because of safety in high-speed roads. Yet, if this 1 red light burns out, there is no more protected only left turn. This would become a permissive or protective permissive, where people would be turning on the solid green. So it makes no sense to argue we have to increase this restriction for road safety while simultaneously have the entire restriction dependent on 1 single bulb not burning out. So the only configuration that Winnipeg hasn't done is putting in the far left corner head, which is what I would argue for. And again, this one head in the far side like this is a direct violation of national engineering minimum standards. I have contacted the Transportation Association of Canada, and they have confirmed that this is not allowed. Winnipeg is in, again, a violation of national engineering requirements. And the only answer the city seems to have given to this is engineering standards don't apply to Winnipeg because we haven't actually legislated a requirement for this. But again, a serious road safety concern. And just like the protective permissives, in 2015, they were doing the two far side heads. So here is mid-place. Sorry?
Chris, and again, yes. I apologize, Councillor Chambers again.
Yes.
With respect to your comments there about a national transportation standards, I've in a previous motion that Councillor Allard had authored, I added as a friendly amendment to it to have the Federation of Canadian Municipalities provide some input into standardizing, and I can't recall off the top of my head what the exact be it resolved was, or the issue that we were talking, but it had to do with standardizations of whether it was intersections or something to do with transportation. So is there an opportunity to run this up the FCM flagpole to see if that's something that they should be advocating for as well, that all jurisdictions, Canadian cities, major Canadian cities across Canada have a standardized approach to this type of light standards or sign heads or what have you?
Yes, well, the thing is that here's the issue that we face in Canada, and this is a widely known, widely talked about issue in engineering. We have national guidelines, national standards, but they're very rudimentary and foundational. So a lot of these things like duplicity, they're required, or they're foundational principles, and every city except Winnipeg complies with the foundational principles. So some of these issues we're seeing here are unique to Winnipeg. We're the only city that doesn't do duplicity for protected only left turn. Like no other city would ever dare to not follow national standards. That's a purely Winnipeg thing. Like our 4-second yellows were in an 80 zone. Like you're not going to find that anywhere else. But the way the national standards work is they create foundational principles like duplicity. Another foundational principle is consistency. And again, this is largely a Winnipeg problem that they don't do things consistently. But a national problem we see is that when you go from city to city, you will see that that while the principles might be complied with, there is different interpretations of that because we don't have like Ontario has or the US where they've gone into great detail. So for example, to satisfy the duplicity requirement for protected only left turns, Alberta and Saskatchewan largely use the double reds where you'll have one head but two red lights on it. BC will use the far left corner. The Provincial Highways Department will actually use the two on the boulevard typically, except for exceptions in Headingley. But again, that complies with the duplicity requirement, but it's all different interpretations of it. So the things that are unique to Winnipeg are not complying with foundational minimums and not picking a standard and doing it consistently. Now, what we need on a national, so the Federation of Municipalities really can't be much help in that because that's a uniquely Winnipeg problem. Where I would suggest the Federation be involved is what we need is a guideline standard to be drawn up for a national adoption to start standardizing how these principles are applied. And it's actually something I've worked out. I've already written a draft manual that I'm hoping to eventually present that I think Winnipeg could be a leader on a national scale of cleaning up not only our city, but trying to create national standards to start going into greater detail and seeing uniformity across cities instead of just within cities. But we're so far behind in Winnipeg because we don't even have uniformity within our own city or comply with the foundational minimums. Does that make sense? Hello?
Yes, thank you. again, I was on mute when you.
Oh, no problem.
So I appreciate the response.
Sorry, I know it's a little drawn out, but these things are not simple. Okay, so this is Lage and Mint Place. You can see in 2015, this is where they started doing their two far side heads. This was the 2015, again, flavor of the year. And then by 2016, they abandoned the two far sides and started using the near sides. And this is St. Mary's and Dakota / Dunkirk. And this one that you can see in the back side of this pole, this was a newly converted protective, it was a formerly protected permissive converted to a protected only in 2021. And as you can see, there is no auxiliary head. So again, confirming the abandonment of that practice. But you can see the lower right side head. So for some reason, the current flavor has been to be adding all these additional heads for the through traffic while not even following minimum requirements for left turns. So it doesn't make sense. And again, just like protective permissive, we see this constant in and out practice. So this is northbound Lage at Fermor. The left side is, this whole time it's been one turn lane and protected only, it still is today. And you can see here that this is the one single head for one left turn lane. Then I believe it was around 2014, they converted it to the two. And then when they did construction around 2019, 2020-ish, they took out the double davit and went back to the single. So we see 1, 2, back to 1 for the same approach to the same intersection. And the whole time it's been a constant one turning lane. Now, to explain the need for duplicity, here's an example of a burnout. And here's another burnout, except this is actually a protected only left turn, like what we're talking about. You can see the left side head is burnt out. Or even doing maintenance. So here they're doing signal head changing, and you can see this one's currently out of service, and so it's only this one functioning. Or in this case, this is a situation where the left turn head, the boulevard pole was actually knocked down, and you can see that they've got, they capped the hole here on the boulevard. And while this pole was lying down, they actually put the intersection back in service, but without the left turn head functioning. Now, I don't have the proper media player on this computer to play the video, but because that one head was the only left turn arrow and it was out of service, it actually caused mayhem that basically shut this entire intersection down during rush hour. This was St. Mary's in Dakota, because the controller didn't know the left turn arrow was out of service, so it was still running it. And then because nobody was actually turning left because they didn't know the arrow was on, all they had was a red light, it actually caused the what's called gap extension or extension to trigger, which was actually extending the left turn arrow, trying to clear this left turn demand, and was holding back all the other directions and trying to clear this left turn demand, and yet nobody was going. So it created this feedback loop of chaos that basically incapacitated this entire intersection from operating during rush hour. And the city was nowhere to be found. All they did was cap the pole and put the intersection back in service. So again, this speaks to the need for duplicity, and especially in a city like Winnipeg that uses breakaway light standards. And now this is largely part 3, but just as an introductory slide, I want to point out this is the same corridor. And Winnipeg can't make up its mind on how to do configuration for push buttons for corridors. So this is St. Anne's Road in Belleville. You can see the older standard, and this is still the provincial one, is the buttons were on opposite sides of the pole. So when you were walking towards the pole, you would push the button for the side of the road you're about to go. So people going this way would push this button to continue crossing, and vice versa. That was the older standard. Then I guess it was around 2006, they started going to the stacked buttons. Then by about 2007, they were doing an angled configuration where the two buttons were on a 45-degree angle. And then around 2012, they went back to the stacked. And then in 2017, they were taking out all the stacked buttons and putting in a single button to control both sides, whereas the whole thing was acting as basically one crosswalk. And then in 2018, they went back to the stacked. Now, no one intersection, again, we have this problem where they never actually get the whole city standardized before changing again. So the whole city right now at this time is a hodgepodge of all these different configurations from different eras. The only one that's extinct is the original one, and ironically, the one the province still uses, being these opposite sides of the pole. The angled buttons are all over the place, the stacked buttons, and these single buttons were very short-lived. This was only a 2017 thing. Most are all gone now, but there is the odd one around that they've missed. Just like the double davits on the protective permissive left turns, the only straggler for that one is Panet Road and Monroe northbound. That's still like that today. I think the department just doesn't know about it. But so this case, Belleville, we have the back-to-back buttons, then we had the stacked buttons, then in 2017 they went to a single button, and then in 2018 they went back to stacked. And in the case of this change, they actually had to change all the overhead lights as well, which we'll talk about in the third presentation. Now, we talked at the opening about the changing of the 8A12 heads. This is just another example of it. You can see this is a very new 8A12 head. It's on a fairly new davit pole. And this was one of the ones that they changed to a 12-12-12. And again, it's on a 50-kilometer-per-hour road. It's certainly not a high-speed road where you'd want to consider maybe needing larger sized lenses. And even then, the engineering manual only requires 12-inch reds for 80 zones. This is not at all an 80 zone, and even if it was, this would still be in compliance with national standards. So again, we're seeing this mass change out of things that already comply with national standards, just as basic scrapping of things of infrastructure that is not at all past its useful life and still complies with national standards, while building things brand new that don't comply with the minimums at all. Now, I'll point out something else just while we're looking at it is, in this picture here, we have a push button's gone, and you can see the head here is facing forwards and this one's facing sideways. So this is just a little bit of foreshadowing for what I'm going to get into in the third part. This is just residual from part one, but you can see here, this intersection was rebuilt in 2015, and you can see we have the head here. This one has a wide reflective stripe on a davit style arm that was brand new in 2016. And then in 2017, they changed the arm out. There's the putty hole, put a cantilever style arm, and changed the head. So again, this arm and head only had a 1-year lifespan, and the city's explanation was aesthetic preference. And again, just kind of rehashing from part one, here's these different circles we see of putting in and taking out. So this is all Pembina Highway southbound at Markham. It starts off with one above the road and one on the boulevard. Then in 15, they converted to cantilever poles. Now we have 2 above and 1 on the side. And then in 2017, they took out the one on the side, so it's only 2 above. And then in 2018, they put the head they had added, sorry, they had in 15 on the new cantilever, they took out, put back. So from year to year, we're seeing these heads going in, coming out, going back in. And Henderson Highway and Monroe was an example from just this past summer. In July, they took the left side head out and then put it back on December 27th. So again, it's just this in, out, in, out. And if they were working on this intersection today, their focus would be putting one on the right side. So again, there's just no pattern and no consistency. And the effects of safety. Well, I talked about the driver turns left and has the 3 variables that they have to watch, opposing traffic. But here's an example of what happens when you simply misdirect drivers. This is Chief Peguis and Henderson. I talked about it earlier. This is a double davit pole. It has the 2 left turn arrows, but it's there's only one approach to this intersection, being the southbound, which is the one we're looking at right now, that has a single left turn lane. So again, I'd argue that this one should have only one head on the boulevard. And this seems to be the common kind of crash that I see, where 2 drivers will think that they're in the left turn lane, but only the left driver's in the actual turn lane. The second driver over is actually in a straight lane, but they're misled to think that it's a turning lane, and they'll turn. And sometimes if the driver in the left lane wants to cut over to the right, they will push that guy over. And this is the kind of crashes we often see. The other thing we'll see happen is that because these left turns are actuated, in the second lane over, which is actually the straight lane, in the middle of the night, you'll often see a car sitting there with his blinker on, waiting for the left turn arrow. The left turn arrow will never come on because the sensor is only in the one lane, because the traffic lights know there's only one turning lane, but the traffic lights are making the driver think there's 2. So if the driver chooses what they think is the right turn lane, they're actually in a straight lane, they don't trigger that sensor. They'll be sitting there all night waiting for that arrow. Now, better case scenario is that somebody else will come in the true left turn lane and trigger it. But what can also happen is that person basically will just sit there with their blinker on, waiting to get rear-ended from somebody in the straight lane because it's protected only, or they'll just get fed up and go through the red, which is something else we often see. And again, that's very good for enforcement. We very commonly you'll see the police at these kinds of locations waiting to ticket, but not good for road safety, not good for traffic efficiency, and not good for promoting respect for traffic control devices. good for the police. So this is another example. This is an extreme example of why I argue we should have left turn ahead in the far left corner. This is a permissive left turn. There is no turn arrow. You can see we have a davit pole here holding the head out over the road. There isn't even a side mount head in the boulevard, and yet this boulevard's so wide. You can see the angling of the driver of the vehicle when the driver's trying to make a left turn here. So again, considering our three things that the driver has to consider, you've got opposing traffic, competing pedestrians, and the traffic lights by our traffic signal head. By having this traffic signal head to the right of the driver, you're forcing the driver to look to the right. In this case, they're pretty much having to look out through their passenger side window to watch that traffic signal while supposed to be watching opposing traffic. And again, we see this is what promotes this trap where you tunnel vision on the opposing traffic, bounce your attention between the opposing traffic and the head, see a brake coming, watch the head. When that brake comes, you gun it and plow down the pedestrian. If we put the head over here above this, above the crosswalk head, or even further back here, facing this turning driver, it would be encouraging them to put their attention over here and not to the right. So again, this is the issue that I've been addressing. So that concludes my presentation on traffic signal configuration and heads. So I'd like to wrap that up and take a quick break.
Okay. Well,
did anybody have any questions or discussion?
Okay. So you need